All right, so we're back. And today we're going to be doing a deep dive into a case that has baffled investigators for decades. The 1977 Camp Scott Girl Scout murders. Three young girls, Lori Farmer, Michelle Gus, and Denise Milner, were brutally killed on a rainy June night, and the mystery remains unsolved. We've got some fascinating sources about this case, and I can't wait to unpack them with you all and see what we can uncover together.
It's a story that has captivated the public's attention for years, and for a good reason. The combination of the setting, a seemingly safe Girl Scout camp, and the brutality of the crime really shook people to the core.
Right. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about safety and security. But what strikes me is the initial confusion surrounding the investigation. Just 5 years after the murders, Sheriff Paul Smith made a cryptic statement about having 3 suspects in mind, but refusing to name them. What do you make of that? Why wouldn't he reveal their identities?
It's a perplexing move, isn't it? Some speculate that these suspects might have had powerful connections locally, or perhaps ties to organized crime. That could explain the reluctance to publicly pursue them.
It's almost like something out of a movie, right? This small town with dark secrets lurking beneath the surface. But then there's also the theory that multiple people were involved in the murders. Do you think that's a possibility?
The evidence certainly suggests it. The level of violence inflicted, the signs of sexual assault, even the logistics of moving 3 bodies, it all points to the potential for more than one perpetrator.
Imagine the frustration for the victims' families, knowing that suspects might have been identified, but never brought to justice. It adds another layer of tragedy to this already horrific story. As we delve further, I'm curious to see if any of the sources shed light on this. But first, let's talk about William Stevens. He seems to be a figure who keeps popping up in connection with the case.
Stevens was a convicted rapist from Kansas and became a person of interest early on. Just 2 years after the Camp Scott murders, a witness named Kimberly Lewis identified him from a photograph as someone she'd seen near the camp around the time of the killings.
Her statement, "That looks like the man," must have sent shockwaves through the investigation. Was that the only link they had to Stevens, though?
Not at all. His criminal history, including violent sexual offenses, aligned with many of the characteristics investigators believed the Camp Scott killer might possess. And to add to the intrigue, he had connections to Leroy Hart, another prominent figure in this case. Both men were allegedly part of a criminal network.
So not only does Stevens have a history of violence, but he was also potentially connected to the area and to someone with a criminal past like Hart. Seems like the pieces were starting to fit together, yet he was never charged. Why do you think that is?
That's one of the biggest questions surrounding this case. Was it a lack of solid evidence? Were there missteps in the investigation? Or was there something more sinister at play, perhaps involving those unnamed suspects Sheriff Smith mentioned?
It makes you wonder if there was a cover-up, doesn't it? But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's talk about Leroy Hart. He's practically synonymous with the Camp Scott murders. What made him such a key figure?
Hart was a convicted felon who had escaped from prison and was living in the woods near Camp Scott at the time of the murders. That alone made him a prime suspect.
Being in such close proximity to the camp, especially with his criminal background, certainly raises eyebrows. What was the public reaction to him being named as a suspect?
His capture after a months-long manhunt turned his trial into a national sensation. The media coverage was intense, and the nation was glued to the developments.
And if I remember correctly, there was a fair amount of circumstantial evidence against him, right?
There was. Items found at his hideout were believed to be stolen from Camp Scott, and a nearby cave contained graffiti that some thought implicated him. It seemed like a strong case, but then something unexpected happened. He was acquitted.
Wait, acquitted, despite all that evidence? I'm curious to hear more about how that happened. What was the defense's strategy?
Hart's defense team skillfully raised doubts about the integrity of the investigation and the evidence presented. They even suggested some of it might have been planted, playing on the existing prejudices against Native Americans that were prevalent at the time. Essentially, they painted him as a victim of a biased system.
So they were able to convince the jury that there was reasonable doubt. It's a shocking turn of events, especially for the victims' families who were hoping for a conviction.
Absolutely. And sadly, we'll never know for sure whether Hart was guilty or not. He died just 2 months after his acquittal due to a heart attack, while serving time for his previous crimes.
It seems like every turn in this case leads to more questions and deeper mysteries. It's a real-life whodunit with no clear answers. But what about the forensic evidence? This was 1977, so technology wasn't what it is today. Did investigators have much to work with?
They collected over 200 pieces of evidence, including a bloody footprint, a flashlight, and numerous items from the crime scene. But back then, forensic science wasn't as advanced, and none of the evidence led to a definitive suspect. It was a frustrating situation for everyone involved.
Imagine being so close to answers, yet just out of reach. Did they ever revisit the evidence with newer technology?
Yes, in 2014, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation re-examined the case using modern DNA testing. It was a beacon of hope, the possibility of finally getting a breakthrough after all these years.
So did the new testing unlock any secrets? Did they finally get the answers they were looking for?
Unfortunately, no. The results were inconclusive. The evidence had degraded significantly over time, and contamination issues made it impossible to extract usable DNA. It was a heartbreaking setback for everyone involved.
It's almost as if the case itself is resisting being solved. But forensic science is constantly evolving. Is there any chance they could try again with even newer techniques in the future?
There's always a chance. Advancements like genetic genealogy, the technique that helped crack the Golden State Killer case, could potentially be used on the Camp Scott evidence if viable DNA samples are ever found. It offers a glimmer of hope, however slim.
That's reassuring to hear. Even though the physical evidence has been a dead end so far, maybe we can gain some insight by looking into the psychology of the perpetrator. What do our sources say about that?
In the late 1970s, criminal profiling was still a relatively new field, but it played a significant role in this case. Dr. Robert Phillips, a clinical psychologist, developed one of the earliest profiles of the potential killer. And his analysis is chilling.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
What did Dr. Phillips' profile reveal about the person who might have committed these horrific acts?
He believed the killer was driven by a deep-seated sense of inferiority and harbored intense feelings of anger and self-loathing. Phillips theorized that these emotions might have manifested as a desire to destroy innocence.
So he was targeting these young girls specifically because of their innocence. That's a truly disturbing thought. Did the profile offer any insights into whether this person might have struck again?
Phillips concluded that the killer was likely not legally insane. He was aware of his actions, methodical and calculating. Based on this, Phillips believed he was capable of killing again.
That's terrifying. It makes you wonder if there are other unsolved cases out there that could be connected to this one. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about a topic that often surrounds cases like this, the occult. Were there any theories about ritualistic elements involved in the Camp Scott murders?
It's important to note that law enforcement never officially pursued occult theories. However, some unsettling events surrounding the murders fueled speculation.
Ooh, this is where things get interesting. Tell me more about these unsettling events.
In the months leading up to the murders, there were strange occurrences at Camp Scott. Counselors and campers reported finding creepy items, like an effigy hanging from a tree. Personal belongings went missing from tents. And perhaps, most chillingly, a note was found 2 months before the murders, predicting the deaths of 3 girls in Tent 1.
Wait, a note predicting the murders. That's incredibly eerie. What was the reaction to that at the time?
It was initially dismissed as a prank, but after the murders, it took on a much more sinister meaning. To this day, we don't know for sure if it was a genuine warning, a bizarre coincidence, or something else entirely.
Given the remote wooded location of Camp Scott, it's easy to see how those kinds of details would spark theories about something more sinister happening. Did any specific groups investigate the occult angle?
Yes, groups like Signature Profiling Associates, who specialize in analyzing crimes with potential occult or ritualistic elements, looked into the case. They proposed that the murders could have been the work of individuals involved in satanic or other unorthodox religious practices.
I can see how that line of thinking would gain traction, especially with all the unexplained events and the lack of a clear suspect. But was there any actual evidence to support those claims?
The official investigation never uncovered any concrete evidence to substantiate the occult theories, but even without proof, they persist, adding another layer of mystique to an already complex and tragic case.
It's a reminder that sometimes the human mind seeks answers in the realm of the unknown, especially when confronted with something as horrific and inexplicable as the Camp Scott murders. But before we wrap things up, there's one more crucial development we need to discuss, a recent legal change that has significantly impacted the case.
You're referring to the landmark Supreme Court decision in McGirt v. Oklahoma, correct?
That's right. For those who might not be familiar with this ruling, can you explain how it changed the game for the Camp Scott investigation?
In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that a large portion of eastern Oklahoma, including the land where Camp Scott is located, is legally recognized as Native American territory. This decision shifted criminal jurisdiction in cases involving Native American victims or perpetrators to either the Cherokee Nation or federal authorities.
So how does this tie into the Camp Scott case specifically? Was any of the victims Native American?
Yes, one of the victims. Denise Milner was identified as having Native American heritage. This means the case now falls under a different jurisdiction.
So the Cherokee Nation is now actively involved in the investigation. What does that mean for the case moving forward?
It's a significant development. They're committed to seeking justice for Denise Milner and her fellow victims. This shift in jurisdiction also brings fresh perspectives and potentially new resources to the investigation.
This must be a glimmer of hope for the victims' families and the Cherokee community, who have waited so long for answers. Do you think this change in jurisdiction could finally lead to a break in the case after all these years?
It's certainly possible. The Cherokee Nation's involvement offers new avenues for investigation, including potentially re-examining old evidence and pursuing new leads. It's too early to say for sure, but this could be the turning point everyone has been waiting for.
It's a reminder that even in cold cases, justice is still possible. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the initial shock of the murders to the frustrating dead ends and the reemergence of hope with the McGirt ruling. What are your thoughts on everything we've discussed so far?
It's a case that defies easy answers. We've examined the evidence, explored the suspects, and delved into these psychological and even the occult theories. And yet the central question remains: who killed Leroy Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Denise Milner?
It's a haunting question that has lingered for decades. But as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want to turn to you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on the Camp Scott murders? Do you lean towards any particular theory? Or are you, like us, left with more questions than answers? It's fascinating to hear all your perspectives and theories. This case really gets under your skin, doesn't it? And that's what makes it so compelling. We've examined multiple suspects, delved into the limitations of forensic science at the time, and even explored the unsettling possibility of occult involvement. Yet the truth remains elusive.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even with all the advancements in technology and investigative techniques, some mysteries simply refuse to be solved. But that doesn't mean we should stop seeking answers.
Absolutely. And with the McGirt ruling bringing a new dimension to the case, perhaps there's renewed hope for justice. The Cherokee Nation's commitment to finding the truth is a powerful force. What do you think, based on everything we've learned today, is the most likely scenario? Was it a crime of opportunity, a carefully planned act, or something driven by darker, more sinister motives?
It's impossible to say for certain. Each theory has its merits and its flaws. But what's clear is that this case wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about seeking justice for 3 innocent lives tragically cut short, and for their families who have endured decades of pain and uncertainty.
You're right. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of unsolved crimes. And it brings us to an important point. If you have any information, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, please contact the authorities. Even the tiniest detail could be the missing piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. Sometimes a seemingly unrelated memory or observation can be the key to unlocking the truth.
And for those of you who are as captivated by this case as we are, we encourage you to keep exploring. There are countless articles, documentaries, and online forums dedicated to the Camp Scott murders. Dive in, research, form your own conclusions.
The pursuit of truth and understanding is a journey, and even if we never definitively solve this mystery, the process of exploration and critical thinking can be valuable in itself.
We can learn from the past, even from its darkest chapters. And most importantly, we must never forget Leroy Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Denise Milner. Their lives were tragically cut short, but their memory lives on. Hopefully someday justice will be served and they will finally find peace. Thanks for joining us on this journey into one of Oklahoma's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Until next time, keep those detective hats on and keep exploring.